Autumn 1910, 10th Avenue, Manhattan. The man mounted his horse before dawn in a stable on the west side of the avenue and rode out into a street that was already alive. The pushcart vendors arrived before first light. Immigrant families moving toward the Washington market filled the sidewalks in both directions, the sidewalks being too narrow for their number. Children crossed without looking. The stoops of the tenements along 10th Avenue released their residents at all hours because the apartments offered no particular advantage over the street, and the street at least had light and the possibility of commerce. The neighborhood had no other character but density. Density was the condition of its existence and the source of its daily economy and the reason the job existed at all. The cowboy's assignment was simple in description and impossible in execution. He rode ahead of the New York Central freight locomotive, now building pressure in the rail yard at 30th Street. When the locomotive moved south along the tracks embedded in the avenue's surface, iron rails set flush with the cobblestones, a detail that made them nearly invisible to pedestrians until the moment they mattered, he rode ahead of it on horseback, waving a red flag by day and a red lantern after dark, clearing the path between the train and whatever the avenue contained. Pedestrians, delivery horses, children playing in the only open space their block provided. He was the warning system. A loaded freight locomotive required several hundred feet to stop from operating speed. The avenue was not several hundred feet wide. The cowboy was the margin between those two measurements, dressed in a wide-brimmed hat and riding through the middle of Manhattan, and the job had existed because the alternative was worse, and the alternative had been documented at the coroner's office on West 54th Street for as long as the tracks had run. He rode south. Behind him, the locomotive began to move. The west side of Manhattan in 1910 was the working machinery of a city of 5 million people, and its machinery ran on iron rails through the middle of its poorest streets. The New York Central Railroad had operated street-level freight tracks along the western edge of the island since the 1840s, when the terrain was largely undeveloped and a track running beside open lots attracted no particular consequence. By 1910, the open lots were gone. In their place stood Hell's Kitchen, one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the United States, home to the Irish and Italian and German immigrants, who worked the docks, the meatpacking plants, the Washington market, and the railroad facilities themselves. The freight the locomotives carried served that market directly. Cattle, hogs, poultry, produce, and dairy arriving daily from the interior of the continent, bound for the stalls and warehouses of the West Side's distribution network, which supplied the entire city. The tracks could not be removed without stopping the food supply of the largest city in the country. They ran at street level for approximately 30 blocks. Locomotives passed through those blocks at speeds that varied with conditions, sometimes at a walking pace when traffic was dense, sometimes faster when the avenue momentarily cleared, and the grade crossings at every block were largely uncontrolled. No gates, no signals in most locations. The locomotive's whistle was the primary warning, and the whistle was audible for a shorter distance than the stopping distance required. The newspapers had been calling the avenue Death Avenue since the 1890s. The name was accurate. By 1910, the cumulative death toll from the street-level tracks was estimated in the hundreds. Men, women, and children killed at crossings that the railroad's operational requirements made statistically inevitable. The dead were disproportionately the residents of the avenue's tenements, recent arrivals from southern Europe and Ireland whose daily life required crossing the tracks dozens of times, and whose children had no other streets to play in. The railroad responded to legislative pressure by employing the cowboys. They were not a solution. They were the railroad's demonstration to any legislator who asked that the problem had been acknowledged. The people of 10th Avenue understood the distinction. They crossed the tracks anyway. There was nothing else to cross. The campaign to remove the street-level operations from Manhattan's west side had been in progress, in various formal and informal configurations, for the better part of 4 decades before the agreement was signed. Each significant death generated newspaper coverage. Coverage generated resolutions from the Board of Aldermen. Resolutions generated correspondence with the New York Central's legal and operating departments, which generated responses noting the railroad's compliance with existing ordinances and the cowboys' deployment as the required safety measure. The correspondence was filed. The tracks remained. The political arithmetic was not difficult to read. The railroad served the commercial interests of the entire city's food distribution system, and the people being killed were residents of Hell's Kitchen, whose capacity to direct consequence toward Albany was not proportionate to their share of the mortality records. The full line ran approximately 13 miles along Manhattan's west side, connecting the rail yards at the northern end to the St. John's Park Freight Terminal near the Hudson River in the south. The total cost of the West Side Improvement Project, encompassing the elevated line, the associated infrastructure improvements, and the reconstruction of the West Side surface, ran to figures that made it among the largest capital expenditures any American railroad undertook in the interwar period. The structure, when complete, was functional and largely invisible. It passed through the city's industrial fabric at second-floor height, unremarkable to anyone not looking for it, carrying its locomotives above the streets that had generated the mortality records for 90 years. The first section of the West Side elevated line opened for freight service in 1934. Locomotives began moving through the meatpacking district and Lower Chelsea sections above street level that year. On the corresponding blocks, the surface operations ceased. For the first time since the original tracks had been laid in the 1840s, 10th Avenue at those locations carried only the traffic that belonged to it: vehicles, pedestrians, the vendors and workers and residents who had been navigating around freight trains for the duration of their lifetimes and their parents' lifetimes and, in some cases, their grandparents' lifetimes. The Cowboys' territory contracted as the elevated sections came into service. Block by block, the jurisdiction of the mounted flagman was transferred to the elevated structure above, where no flagman was required and no pedestrian was at risk. On the sections where the High Line now operated, the job ceased to exist. On the remaining street-level sections, the Cowboys continued riding through the remainder of the 1930s. The last street-level freight operations on the relevant sections of 10th Avenue ceased in 1941. The final cowboy assigned to those blocks, whoever he was, on whatever morning the operating logs recorded as his last shift, rode his flagging run, cleared the avenue in front of a locomotive that was making one of its last street-level passages, and returned the horse to the stable. The railroad's records noted the operational change. The job was no longer required. The death toll on 10th Avenue in the section served by the elevated line fell sharply following its opening. The avenue continued, the tenements continued. The people of Hell's Kitchen crossed the street without the specific calculation they had been making for 3 generations. The calculation of whether the gap between themselves and the approaching train was wide enough to cross safely. The calculation was simply no longer required. That was the entirety of what the Cowboys had been riding toward for 90 years. The High Line operated as a working freight railway for 46 years following its opening. Through the Second World War, it carried the full volume of food and manufactured goods that the West Side's industrial economy required. Through the 1950s, it served a neighborhood still recognizable as the one that had generated the demand for the Cowboys. Still industrial in character, still employing the workers who lived in the surrounding tenements, still functioning as the productive underside of a city that made and moved things at scale. By the 1960s, the character of the West Side was shifting in ways the elevated line's original logic had not accounted for. The meatpacking plants the High Line had been built to serve were consolidating and, in some cases, relocating. The Hudson River piers, whose traffic had justified the entire West Side freight network, were entering a terminal decline as containerized shipping relocated its operations to facilities in New Jersey that could handle the new dimensions of ocean freight. The buildings the line passed through were losing their original tenants without replacement in kind. Freight volumes decreased each year through the 1970s. The last train ran on the High Line on a date in 1980. Its cargo, documented in accounts that would later be widely cited when the line's subsequent history made such details significant, was a consignment of frozen turkeys. The locomotive passed south through the Chelsea and meatpacking sections, the same corridor the Cowboys had ridden 4 decades earlier, and the freight cars were unloaded at the St. John's Park terminal for the final time. The line was deactivated for freight. The structure sat unused above the street for the following 2 decades. Wild grasses and sumac and ailanthus colonized the gravel ballast between the rails. Demolition proposals were filed with the city. The approvals were granted in principle and not due to procedural delays whose causes were administrative rather than preservationist, immediately executed. In 1999, 2 Chelsea residents, Joshua David, a writer, and Robert Hammond, a figure from the arts community, attended a community board meeting convened to discuss the demolition timeline. They proposed an alternative. The Friends of the High Line, which they founded the same year, advanced the case for conversion rather than demolition. A linear public park, elevated, accessible from street level, running the length of the former freight corridor through the neighborhoods it had once served. The demolition approvals lapsed. The conversion was funded, designed, and built. The High Line opened to the public on June 9, 2009. Its first section ran from Gansevoort Street in the Meatpacking District to 20th Street in Chelsea, less than a mile of former freight track, converted to a narrow elevated park planted with native grasses and perennial species chosen to reference the wild vegetation that had established itself during the line's 29 years of disuse. Visitors ascended by stairways and elevators at street level and found themselves 30 feet above the avenue, above the same surface the Cowboys had ridden, above the same cobblestone crossings that had been measured in hundreds of deaths, looking west to the Hudson and east into the blocks that the freight line had once threaded through. Subsequent sections extended the park to 34th Street by 2014. Annual visitors reached 8 million in peak years, figures that exceeded the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Statue of Liberty and every other comparable draw in the 5 boroughs. The neighborhoods below and adjacent to the High Line underwent a property value transformation that urban economists documented as among the most rapid in the city's modern history. The meatpacking plants and cold storage warehouses that had given the line its operating purpose were replaced by hotels, galleries, boutique retail, and residential construction, whose prices denominated in a currency that bore no relationship to the wages of the people who had lived in the surrounding blocks when the Cowboys rode. The Cowboys themselves appear in a small number of photographs held in institutional archives: the New York Transit Museum, the New York Public Library's picture collection, newspaper archives from the turn of the century. They appear mounted in the middle of the avenue, red flags visible, locomotives at a distance behind them that in several of the images looks insufficient for comfort. Their names are not recorded in the photograph captions. They were New York Central Railroad operational personnel, classified in the same ledger categories as track laborers and yard crews. Those ledgers passed through Penn Central's bankruptcy in 1970 and the subsequent dispersal of the railroad's records. What the Cowboys did survives in the photographs. Who most of them were does not survive at all. The High Line draws 8 million visitors each year. Its landscaping has won International Design Awards. It is described regularly as one of the transformative urban interventions of the century. The Cowboys rode ahead of the trains so the people of 10th Avenue could live in their own streets. The streets they cleared are a park now. The people they protected no longer live in the neighborhood the park remade. The Cowboys have no memorial. The people they rode for have no marker. The High Line carries the traffic of a city built above the foundations of the one the Cowboys knew, moving through the same corridor at the same elevation, toward the same river, without any visible record of what it cost to clear the way.